So we were massively involved in slavery, 3 million enslaved people. But also, we were massively involved in anti-slavery. We went around the world trying to abolish it. We spread the free press, but we also spread press censorship. You know, people are complicated and history is really complicated. The poem White Man's Burden, written by Rudyard Kipling, that poem was written by one of our most famous imperialists to America, saying to the Americans, you should do in the Philippines what we've done in India. This is another thing that's not very well understood. Almost no Indians were drinking tea in 1900. If it became a national drink, it's because of the British. Yep. One of the legacies of slavery in the Caribbean is that the Caribbean has one of the highest rates of diabetes in the world. And guess what? The European powers turned that part of the world into a place of industrial sugar production and sent millions of slaves there. That is a legacy we're responsible for. I don't think you can understand the news without understanding the British Empire. So the Israel-Palestine dispute, war. I mean, very complicated reasons for why that began, but essentially it began during the British Mandate, when the British promised the same area of the world to the Arabs and to the Zionist Jews at the same time through some very unprofessional correspondence. Of course there was going to be war.
Welcome back to the Ramblings of a Sikh channel. I'm your host Amar Singh, and in today's episode we're diving into EmpireWorld, how British imperialism has shaped the world, a thought-provoking and often challenging exploration of the British Empire's far-reaching impact. To guide us through this important conversation, I'm thrilled to be joined by the brilliant author Sathnam Sanghera.
Yeah, one Sikh rambling to another.
Drawing on his travels across Barbados, Nigeria, Mauritius, India, and the US, Sathnam shares the inspirations behind his work, the meticulous research that shaped it, and the reactions it sparked. Rather than glorifying the British Empire or mourning its decline, we'll uncover how its legacy continues to shape societies, politics, and identities today. So, before we dive in, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to support the channel. Now, with that out of the way, let's get straight into it. What led you from Empire Land to EmpireWorld? Like, why did you decide, you know what, I've not had enough of writing books. I'm going to do another book. I'm going to put myself through that whole process again. And then everything else that comes with it. Like, I'm sure you've had a lot of interactions from those on either side of the culture war. So,
interactions, yeah.
Yeah.
Racist letters and death threats mainly. Yeah, no, to be honest, I didn't really want to write a sequel. It wasn't really part of my plan. But I went to Barbados on holiday to escape the whole empire thing. And it turns out Barbados is not a good place to escape the empire, because the whole island was created as a result of the British Empire. And a couple of weeks after I visited, Prince William and Princess Kate went to the Caribbean on their disastrous tour of the Caribbean.
Is that the one where the video is from and she's trying to shake hands with a black lady in the behind
a wire fence?
Yeah, okay.
And they're standing on the back of a Land Rover. And it was considered to be a disastrous tour. Even the monarchist press, even the Telegraph were like, that was a disaster. And it made me realize there's a gap between the way we fail to think about empire and the way the world thinks about it quite a lot, especially the parts of the world that were colonized. In Barbados, it's a big issue. It's in the news. They have an active conversation about reparations. And it just made me realize that this is true for lots of parts of the world. So I wanted to write a book about a gap, the gap between the way in which the world knows the British Empire shaped it and what we think.
And when you say we think, are you talking in particularly about like British ideas of what imperialism was like, or are you just talking more generally?
I'm talking about British ideas.
Okay.
And, David Olusoga said that, pretty well. And he said, the thing is, the conversation about British Empire in Britain has only been a monologue. We talk to ourselves about it. We've not had a dialogue with the world. And the world really wants to talk about it. And you saw it at the coronation, where all these former territories, former colonized places came to London for the coronation and wanted to talk about reparations. They wanted to talk about the Koh-i-Noor diamond. They wanted to talk about the legacies of empire. And the royal family in Britain didn't. And it's becoming increasingly difficult because it's one of the biggest conversations in the world.
And it affects the world in so many different ways. Slightly off tangent, I was reading Kim Ragnar's new book, and I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation, but it's to do with an American massacre of indigenous peoples on an island in the Philippines, I think. And the mountain that this massacre takes place is the Bud Dajo, and I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. But what's more interesting is all of the connections in that book to British imperialism. So I think one of the chief American military guys who kind of organizes and instigates this massacre actually travels to Egypt and sees how the British are dealing with the Egyptians there, and kind of takes those ideas with him as he travels through the Suez Canal, which is again another kind of part and parcel of British imperialism.
Yeah, this has happened a lot. I mean, you know, the poem White Man's Burden, written by Rudyard Kipling, that poem was written by one of our most famous imperialists to America, saying to the Americans, you should do in the Philippines what we've done in India. And they responded really well to it. The president of the United States at the time responded very positively to it. So British Empire has been an inspiration for other empires.
And it's also interesting, just on the Rudyard Kipling bit, like everyone's heard of Kipling. No one's ever, when I say no one, most people haven't heard of his kind of more, in my opinion, dark side, or his more imperialist kind of leanings, which is also interesting to how kind of, I guess, history is retaught. But just coming back, you mentioned, I guess, the inspiration of this kind of starts with Barbados. Equally, you've traveled extensively for this book. What other locations were perhaps most influential in kind of your understanding of empire, or perhaps actually challenging your understanding of empire? Because there's a lot of Indians in India, and I'm not talking the majority, but there are some who are almost like, we want the British Raj back, which baffles me in a lot of ways. I get it as well in some ways, because certain structures and hierarchies are just pushed higher up. But yeah, I just wonder what
Yeah,
were
there's
your
imperial
experiences?
nostalgia in all sorts of former colonies. I think most clearly in Nigeria, I went to Lagos. You know, there's a bunch of schools there set up during empire, which still have very imperial attitudes. They still teach imperial concepts, which is no surprise that British politicians who were educated there, you could guess who I'm talking about, then have, you know, imperial nostalgic ideas, which they tell British people. So yeah, I went to Nigeria, Mauritius, India, Barbados, America, and yeah, it was each territory was different. You know, in India, there's a whole decolonization thing going on, which I don't think British people know about. Modi's really into it, though he's weaponizing it in his Islamophobic way. In Mauritius, the whole country was made by indentured labor, the 1 million Indians that we sent around the world. But there's not a huge conversation there about the legacies of the British Empire. Number of people I met who said, oh, my ancestors arrived as slaves. And it's like, no. The slave phase, enslavement, was a distinct phase. Indenture it was called, it was compared to slavery, but it wasn't slavery. I mean, often as 5-year contracts. It died out after 80 years, mainly because there was so much analysis of it from the people who got rid of slavery. But there's very little awareness even amongst those groups. But, you know, Indians ended up in places like Trinidad, Jamaica, Mauritius, Fiji. The outcomes for them were very different in those areas. But there's very little understanding. I mean, I interviewed V.S. Nepal about 20 years ago with no real understanding of how the Indians ended up in Trinidad. But and he ended up in London. So he was doubly alienated, twice immigrated, right? But there's all sorts of phenomena, like, you know, ganja, so associated with Jamaica, but actually
It was Indians who brought it
it's
over.
an Indian word. If you think about it, sounds Indian, right?
And the whole dreads, like Rastas having dreads, is actually from Indians going over, and the Jetta, as in, like, that's part and parcel of I wouldn't say it's part and parcel of just Udasis or kind of a particular sect, but it's very common in India when you see certain
I didn't know
saints.
that.
Yeah,
But I do
yeah.
know goat curry. That's Indian. You know what I mean? So there weren't many Indians that went to Jamaica, but they shaped the culture in all sorts of ways.
And roti, like I was
roti,
scrolling on my Instagram, and I found like I don't know where she was from, maybe Trinidad or somewhere around there, and she was making roti with whatever it was with, and I was like, hold on.
Yeah, I never made the connections. And also they say roti, and so you're like, mate, is it the same thing? But it's roti.
Yeah. What perhaps was like the most shocking, or like what was perhaps the most like you didn't expect that to happen or to come across it when you were perhaps traveling across these places?
The biggest surprise was the role that plants played. Because, you know, plants, as you got plant one behind your head. Yeah, I just see plants as kind of interior design, you know. But plants were a technology that were at the forefront of imperialism. So, you know, for example, tea.
Yeah.
Now, tea led to the Opium Wars with China, when we refused to pay them with silver and wanted to pay them with hard drugs instead. It was involved in the loss of the American colonies.
Yep.
Boston Tea Party. It led to the transportation of millions of laborers hundreds of thousands to do the work, change the shape of huge parts of the world with tea plantation, change the diet, not only of Britain, but India. And this is another thing that's not very well understood. Almost no Indians were drinking tea in 1900. If it became a national drink, it's because of the British.
Yep. There's a really interesting text that's written in Punjabi. I'll have to find it when I edit this and put it like as a B-roll. And it's written from, I think it's like one of the Singh summarists at the time. So again, we're talking like 1900s. And they're talking about the ills of tea and how it's kind of being pushed into places where it never existed, which is hilarious to read now, considering if you go to an Indian's house, the first thing they're going to offer you
tea, and
is
we
tea.
see is intrinsically tea.
Yeah.
But as Indian, but all sorts of plants. So cinchona, which is the bark from which quinine is produced. British settled plantations of cinchona around the world. What that did is that it made sure that the white men who went to Africa didn't die of malaria, which led to the colonization of Africa. Rubber, we set up rubber plantations in Southeast Asia. That then became hugely profitable and led to the massive war, the 1948 Malayan Emergency, which is probably the darkest episode, one of the darkest episodes of British Empire. You know, it was called the Malayan Emergency for insurance reasons, because if they called it a war, they wouldn't have got the insurance payouts. But
who wouldn't have got the country?
The British.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was very cynical, but all sorts of horrible, torture, mass killings.
Bloody hell.
And it's not very well, but that was all because of rubber.
Yeah.
Which is a plant, right? And so plants were involved in all sorts of ways.
Crazy. Mad. Some of the stuff that you learn when you have these conversations is insane. But no, thank you. Obviously, with your book, you blend your own personal narrative along with history, and it's not exactly a light-hearted topic. What went into ensuring you balance all those elements?
Yeah, no, it's difficult, as this is just, I guess we're talking about narrative technique. I think what I realized from The Boy with the Top Knot, my memoir, which I wrote 15 years ago, if you put your personal story into something, you can bring people into heavy subjects which they normally wouldn't read about. So Boy with the Top Knot was about schizophrenia. I think lots of people wouldn't pick up a book about schizophrenia, but they pick up Boy with the Top Knot thinking it might be funny or whatever. And I realized I can do the same with history, and actually using myself brings people into history books who perhaps wouldn't normally read history books. I find a lot of history books difficult, dense. They assume a lot of knowledge, and they depersonalized. They take the feeling out of things. They don't explain the personalities.
No, they're often quite boring as well.
Quite boring.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think Empireland, I guess that's what it was. It was a mixture of memoir and history. It's quite hard with EmpireWorld to sustain that, because you can't keep saying you don't know anything, because now I know quite
I read
a lot.
A book.
Yeah, so this has less of me in it, I guess. And I guess that's quite hard to make the tone work out, because sometimes I'm there and sometimes I'm not there.
Like, you mentioned that you were in America, and you were saying how the legacies of empire are different everywhere. What is it like in America? Because like, I was in New York in September or October, and like, it didn't really ever come up in conversation, as in empire does, but it seems to, like, as in my uncle lives in America, and it almost seems to them as though it's a British thing, which is totally, kind of ironic, because they are born out of the same process.
Totally. Americans don't see themselves as a legacy of the British Empire, mainly because they fought the British. They rejected them. And this is my theory as to why almost every actor who plays a Nazi in a Hollywood film is a British person. They find it very easy to believe British people are evil, because they associate them with the empire and they see themselves as anti-imperial. But the fact is, the United States is an imperial legacy. You know what I mean? The Puritans had a massive influence of in terms of population. Like, I think there are 21,000 of them, and by the end of the 20th century, I think that population had turned into 16 million. And also their culture, they were very religious people, wanted to set up capitalism, were obsessed with property rights. Their culture defined the shape of America. So I would say America, clearly an imperial legacy.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's racism, obviously. British people really struggle with this because they beat the evil racist Nazis. We have Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister. But when racial science first emerged in the 19th century, it had a British flavour. It became something else in America, slightly different. It became something else in Germany. But Britain played a big role.
Well, even the martial races was all based on that same scientific, like pseudo-scientific method of, well, you guys are just bigger, therefore you must be better at fighting wars.
It's all connected.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, completely.
And those racist ideas still persist, so much so that we Sikhs see ourselves through that
same
martial
lens.
race theory. It's not just us, I think the Gurkhas do as well.
Yeah.
I mean, whenever you hear about the Gurkhas in the British press, always through the military lens, right? And that was a British idea. They decided the Gurkhas, the Sikhs, the Highlanders were all martial people.
But again, I guess this nicely flows on to the next question, which is it goes to show there's contradictions and complexities, because to me, it's a contradiction that the Sikhs have almost, and again, it's evident there is a martial tradition within Sikh history prior to the British. But the British doubled down on that. And it's just interesting how then we've almost engulfed that concept and really kind of just steamrolled with that, rather than actually saying there's a diversity perhaps within our community.
They've internalized it. And people always get cross whenever I mention the way the British turned us into martial art, because obviously there was a martial heritage there and tradition right from the beginning.
But it was alongside loads of other traditions.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not just the only thing that we did. Yeah.
What the British did by turning us into this martial race is that indulging us is that they made it advantageous to be Sikh in India. And so there were a lot of conversions in the late 19th century. So the size of the Sikh community is arguably in the diaspora is a legacy of the British Empire. Also the fact that there's Sikhs everywhere you go.
The fact that we're even here, yeah.
There's Sikhs everywhere. I always say, wherever you go, if you go to Australia, Alaska, the first thing you come across is a Sikh taxi driver. And that's because the Sikhs took advantage of the opportunity to travel within empire. East Africa, London, they were amongst the first to really go for it.
Yeah. And even like my family, like we're twice migrated in terms of they went to Kenya for, again, I can't figure out why. I'm still trying to research and find perhaps a plausible explanation. And then obviously Idi Amin kicks everyone out, and so we end up here. So again, the legacies of empire are so far reaching, as in it was only in the 70s that Idi Amin kicked people out. It's not that far back. But just continuing with those complexities of empire, like what other things do you think hold those type of complex? Because I guess history is not necessarily black and white when it comes to this, because just like with the Sikhs, we've benefited from it, but now with hindsight, we could kind of look back and go, well, that was some pseudo-scientific bollocks. Like, what was going on over there?
Also, we were victims of it.
Yeah.
When necessary, the Sikhs weren't allowed to drive trains. They were blown from the end of cannon when necessary, at the same time as being indulged. But this is my conclusion in EmpireWorld, is that whatever you say about the British Empire, the legacies of it, the opposite is true to a certain degree. So we were massively involved in slavery, 3 million enslaved people. But also, we were massively involved in anti-slavery. We went around the world trying to abolish it. We spread the free press, but we also spread press censorship when it got too much. We, spread democracy indirectly through complicated means. So places like Australia and Canada and New Zealand became democratic, but then seeded geopolitical chaos in huge parts of the world: Kashmir, Sudan, Nigeria. It's a really long list. Pakistan, and it just goes on and on. I mean, we caused huge environmental destruction, destroyed the forests all around India. 60% of New Zealand's forests destroyed. But equally, British imperialists were involved in the birth of environmentalism. They set up national parks. They tried to preserve environmental areas, but also they hunted animals to the point of extinction, and then they tried to save them so they could carry on hunting them. So whatever you look at, it's deeply. I would say it's a bit like people. Whatever I say about you, the opposite is probably true to some. I mean, it's definitely, I'm an introvert, but I don't mind doing stuff like this.
Yeah, likewise.
People are complicated, and history is really complicated.
Yeah, no, I like that. Considering EmpireWorld is about how empire affects the world today, what do you think are some of the impacts of empire that people just haven't got an idea of, or perhaps would be surprised when you explain that actually, if you trace this back far enough, it connects somehow to the British Empire?
God, there's so much. I mean, there's so much. I don't think you can understand the news without understanding the British Empire. So let's just, the Israel-Palestine dispute, war. I mean, very complicated reasons for why it began, but essentially it began during the British Mandate, when the British promised the same area of the world to the Arabs and to the Zionist Jews at the same time through some very unprofessional correspondence. Of course there was going to be war. Nigeria and entire nations wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Britain. Nigeria wouldn't exist.
India wouldn't exist.
India wouldn't exist. In
Pakistan wouldn't exist.
It wouldn't exist.
Bangladesh wouldn't exist.
Cities like Nairobi wouldn't exist.
No. Well, most of East Africa would still be completely uninhabitable to a degree, because I was reading into how how Indians were brought to East Africa in order to essentially colonize the area. And a lot of it was actually to clear land.
Yeah.
It was just to clear land. So if we hadn't been sent there to clear the land, it would but as you're saying, those cities and those ports would just never have existed.
Yeah, patterns of tax avoidance. All of those islands were former British colonies, sort of.
And causing all sorts of news headlines like that Nadim's, or I don't know his name. I just saw,
he got former chancellor.
Yeah, tax dodging or whatever, and then declared something, and then it turned out he had to pay a fine. And again, that's because of empire. That's allowed to happen.
At the moment, the borders of Guyana are being disputed by Venezuela. There might be a war. Those borders were drawn up by the British during empire. Hong Kong, ongoing issues there. But loads of stuff like rum wouldn't exist. Rum is a consequence of the history of Barbados. Tea, so many things to do with food. God, the food stuff is crazy, isn't it?
What do you think is perhaps the most surprising food stuff?
Well, I think the tea thing's really interesting. But also the fact that, chilies didn't exist in India.
Well, when I found out that tomatoes aren't indigenous to India, it blew my mind, because todka isn't it's historical to a degree, but as in, at what point did then tomatoes from South America move over, and then when did we decide to add it in?
Yeah, spicy food. I mean, Indian food and British food in the 16th century was quite similar. It was just stews, basically, because they didn't have a lot of the ingredients. So the British people going there weren't like, oh my God, this food's really spicy. They probably thought it was quite familiar.
Oh, wow.
Stuff like that blows your mind. People go on about cultural appropriation. All culture is appropriation, especially when it comes to food.
Yeah.
You can do it well,
yeah,
and you can do it badly.
What do you think has been the biggest criticism with your new book in particular, and how do you think that you've dealt with it, or what do you think your reply is to?
The thing I get more often than anything is, why are you going on about the legacies of the British Empire? The empire ended a long time ago. Shouldn't these countries have dealt with it? What about the legacies of the Roman Empire? Etc. That's the thing I get most. And okay, it's a fair point, but I would say let's use the examples of the legacies of slavery in the Caribbean, right? One of the legacies of slavery in the Caribbean is that the Caribbean has one of the highest rates of diabetes in the world. And guess what? The European powers turned that part of the world into a place of industrial sugar production and sent millions of slaves there. That is a legacy we're responsible for. On top of that, we didn't allow the enslaved to have any healthcare, really. When we left, we gave them no real money to set up their healthcare systems. And then on top of that, in the modern day, we still go there and poach their healthcare workers. There's nothing distant about that history. It's now. We're doing it now. We're turning up there right now. It's not like the legacy of the Roman Empire. It's not abstract. Also, this is something we clearly caused, and we're making worse. So people like to say, oh, this is an abstract thing you're talking about, but it's not, because these are things that affect people now.
What do you also think of those people who would say that you're talking about the past and focusing on the British Empire rather than focusing on the more immediate kind of conflicts and the things that are going on at the moment? What would you say to those people?
Yeah, I mean, that comes up. There's all sorts of conflicts around the world. Israel-Palestine comes up a lot. I think you can't understand absolutely everything. I think actually British Empire helps you to understand those conflicts. Sometimes it's directly responsible for some of those conflicts. I focus on the British Empire because it was the biggest empire in human history. And also I'm British.
Yeah.
Also, you can't focus on you could focus on the whole of imperialism. But
that would be an extensive piece of work.
That's quite a lot of work, So if people have got that criticism, my advice to them is write that book.
Just then, going back to your book, you kind of aim to educate rather than accuse. Why do you think that's important? And I guess, can you really, like, as in, I guess some people listening to this would perhaps be like, well, is there no morality when dealing with history? So at some point you have to be like, well, maybe this is actually kind of bad.
Yeah, I think you can absolutely respond in that way and have emotional reactions to things that happen. I'm not saying that that doesn't matter. I just think overall, this history should not be viewed through the prism of any feelings of like pride and shame, because that is pretty much what we've done for the hundreds of years. And he hasn't really got us anywhere. He hasn't led to a better understanding. And for me, it's more important that we grapple with this intellectually rather than through the prism of feelings, especially when there are practical consequences to all of this. Because, we're going around as a country at the moment trying to establish new relationships with the world because of Brexit, and we turn up to these countries not knowing what we did last time. They remember. They really do. They remember. They remember what happened the last time the British turned up in a boat, and it's just embarrassing. It's really embarrassing. And I hear it all the time from like diplomats when, you saw it on camera where Boris Johnson was trying to recite a Rudyard Kipling poem in Myanmar or somewhere. And he was trying to be persuaded out of it. In my experience, the Foreign Office is full of really highly educated people who have a sense of history, but the politicians don't. So it's really embarrassing when the politicians turn up and start spouting imperially nostalgic nonsense or just ignorant stuff. Like Tony Blair, for example, famously saying in his memoir when he gave back Hong Kong to the Chinese that he was only dimly aware of the history. You can bet every Chinese person is taught about the Opium Wars at school. They teach kids about the Century of Humiliation. But then we literally turn up and we don't know what the Opium Wars are. I think there was another incident where David Cameron turned up in China wearing a poppy, not aware of what that meant.
Is it partly because these politicians actually want to see themselves in that same light, as in they want to almost, like, it almost feels as though, like, you can't be that stupid and ignorant, or maybe you can in terms of Boris Johnson, to turn up and be like, yeah, I'm going to read a Rudyard Kipling poem to Myanmar. Or is it just the fact that actually it's like, I guess, the same thing that drove Brexit. It's this nostalgia again of, we were once great. And I don't include myself in that we, just for clarification, but in terms of, it's like, we were once great, we can do it all over again. Or is it actually just plain stupidity? Like, as in, to me, it seems as though you can't be that dumb.
I think it's a mix of things. Sometimes people go around the world, British people, and they see people speaking English and they feel proud. They think, oh gosh, look at this. Or they see Shakespeare being studied, or they see the legacy of the British Empire, people drinking tea, and they think, oh, that must mean that these people love us. So it's a kind of misinterpretation of what it means,
Yeah.
But also there's that, I understand how the pride works. We're a tiny country. What Britain did was incredible.
Yeah.
Like, just in terms of amount of stuff, a quarter of the planet, and then influencing a large amount of the planet beyond that.
Yeah, without actually, yeah.
I can see why you would be obsessed with that. And we never really processed it because we went straight from the empire to Commonwealth, never really thought about what it meant. There's never been a dark night of the soul.
What do you also think, like, about the fact that, so in my opinion, your book is aimed at those people who are willing to either engage with British imperialism, history, however you want to word it, or are willing to be slightly challenged in their worldview. And I'm asking this more so in light of the Defiance series that was on Channel 4, simply because the whole NF or the far right movement in this country very much bases itself on this idea of, like, British imperialism and nostalgia. Like, I remember there's an infamous recording from the BBC News program the day of the Brexit vote, I think, and it's some big fat burly guy, and he's like, essentially, like, we'll be fine, we'll be great, we were the British Empire and we need Empire 2.0, which kind of, for me, demonstrates the connection between being ignorant about history and far right white nationalism in this country. What do you think needs to be done in order to educate that? Not educate it, because I don't know whether you can, but in terms of almost combating that type of ideology, because the politicians don't seem to be bothered.
Yeah, no, it's particularly worrying. I think it's more worrying that like the civil servants and politicians don't understand the history, and you can't expect ignorant people to have these stupid ideas. But when, Rishi Sunak seems to have no sense of the struggles that Asian people faced in the 70s and 80s, the murders, the far-right violence. Rishi and his colleagues are trying to create this idea that we were spontaneously got rid of racism. It's all over now because we elected him PM. First of all, no one elected him.
Yeah, no one put that guy in.
And we're about to have a vote. Let's see how that goes for you, mate.
Hopefully it doesn't go in it. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's a complete whitewashing of what happened. But you see it in another extreme way through within Windrush. There were civil servants involved. So little understood the imperial history that they're deporting people who are British citizens. I think there's been a huge amount of shock about the post office scandal. I think Windrush is as bad as the post office scandal. And it's just been pushed under the carpet.
But don't you think, though, that the reactions to both of those goes to show deep down, really, in the kind of the mass of the British public, they don't really care?
They care if it's an ITV drama, seemingly.
No, but they
care until they...
No, but the thing is like, so maybe this is just my what's the word, exposure to these things. But like, there's been all sorts of programs on various news channels, various TV programs like BBC, Channel 4, ITV, all to do with British history, imperialism. You've done one yourself, right? Like, not just to plug it, but like you've done one. What I mean is, there's been plenty of content on that. I get one ITV drama turns up and it is a drama. It's very much constructed in a different format, and it has such a visceral response. It almost feels as though because that's more immediate and it's financial, people actually give a shit. Whereas Windrush is black folk and it's a few.
I think you've touched upon it there. I think it's because it's black people. If I'm honest, I feel the mass public feel untouched by it, right? And the post office scandal, when it first emerged, it was a lot of Asian people.
Yeah, it was a lot of Asians.
Class 6.
Yeah.
Went to jail, right?
Yeah.
And so you can decide it's them lot, isn't it? It's not really us. And the ITV drama, the main hero of it was
a white guy.
So you've got to make it feel like it affects people, and maybe you can get away with these scandals because you can get away, frankly, with.
Well, Grenfell was majority non-whites.
Frankly, you can get away with the NHS falling apart.
Yeah.
It's until it affects you, you're not angry about it. And I think there's that thing in Britain. It's like until it affects you, you don't really care.
I wouldn't disagree. No, touche. My last question. What hope do you have that EmpireWorld will have on its readers and on just the general public?
I don't know about my book, but in general, I started writing about Empire about 4 or 5 years ago. And I feel quite optimistic. I've been surprised by the progress. This is going to sound weird because I'm a very negative person and in general, but I never would have thought that when I started writing Empireland that the British Museum would be giving long-term loans of loot back to Ghana or West Africa. I wouldn't have thought the royal family would be saying, yeah, we should have research into our connections to slavery. There was a survey out recently which said that 44% of British people think the royal family should pay reparations for slavery, which was high, given I think
that's a shock. Yeah,
most people didn't realize the royal family were involved with slavery until last year, and I sense that it's been taught quite a lot in academies and private schools and outside the curriculum. It's a conversation in the newspapers every day, often a toxic conversation. But overall, things have gone much further than I thought in a positive way. We even had Keir Starmer defending the National Trust when it comes to colonialism, and I feel like this government's culture war days are highly numbered, and it's going to be over soon. And
why do you think that would happen, or why do you think that would end?
This whole imperial culture war was something Boris Johnson came up with. It's never been tested in an election. It's actually quite a recent thing, and I feel like there's not many politicians. There's certain politicians, Suella, Kemi, Jacob Rees-Mogg, still doing it, but I feel like fewer and fewer people are doing it. And I think the British public have seen through it.
And are sick of it.
Yeah.
Fair. Okay. No, thank you. I've got to the end of my questions.
Oh, thanks, man.
No, not a problem. I just want to say thank you, obviously, for doing this. Thank you if you've made it this far. Your time and curiosity truly fueled these discussions. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into how British imperialism has shaped the world. If the conversation resonated with you, don't forget to hit subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. A special thanks to the brilliant Sathnam Sanghera for shedding light on the complexities of imperial history. Your support means everything, and if you'd like to go further, consider joining us on Patreon or becoming a YouTube member for early access to all our videos. For history enthusiasts, you can explore our shop at ramblingsofasik.co.uk, where you'll find over 180 books, 30 comics, and a range of historical prints and ephemera to dive even deeper into history. Stay tuned for what's coming next. We have plenty more fascinating stories and historical perspectives to explore. Until then, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.